Great. Welcome everyone to the CRC Roundtable. This month we are talking about tidal wetlands. The Roundtable is a monthly virtual webinar series where we host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. The webinars are designed for contribution, not consumption, so each webinar invites a diverse range of researchers, managers, and other professionals to have conversations around critical topics. The point of this is to build connectivity between all of us, provide a place to ask clumsy questions, and increase our collective understanding for decision making. As a reflection of that intent, the panelists were given 30 minutes total for presentation, allowing a full 25 minutes for discussion. These webinars are recorded, and past webinars are available on the CRC website and the Roundtable's YouTube channel. So if you've missed any of our past discussions, I encourage you to go and check them out. As we get started, please type your name, organization, and location into the chat box so everyone can see our webinar community today. We also ask that you stay muted with your camera off while speakers are presenting. Now, we like to start each webinar by asking why this topic, why now, and why these speakers. And tidal wetlands are among the Chesapeake Bay's most valuable ecosystems, providing critical habitat, improving water quality, storing carbon, and helping protect communities from flooding and shoreline erosion. Yet these ecosystems are increasingly under pressure from sea level rise, changing hydrology, storms, invasive species, development, and other stressors. For managers, restoring tidal wetlands is no longer simply a matter of restoring a site to historical conditions. It requires thinking about how wetlands can persist, migrate, and adapt to a changing landscape. Decisions about where and how to invest in restoration must account for ecological conditions, land availability, competing uses, and the needs of communities and landowners. And these challenges highlight the importance of connecting science, monitoring, planning, and on-the-ground management to build tidal wetland systems that remain resilient and continue providing critical benefits into the future. And as we move forward with updated tidal wetland goals in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, we're thinking through all of these factors that will influence our decision making and ultimately our successes. And we're delighted to have our two speakers with us today to share their experience and expertise. So I'm happy to introduce you to Ben Sagara, a wetlands biologist with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and Kate Tully, an associate professor at the University of Maryland's College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. So speakers, I will gracefully let you know if we bump up against the time by turning on my camera. And attendees, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat as we go along. If we don't get to your questions during the webinar, we'll give the speakers an opportunity to address them after, and we'll share any information and resources mentioned during today's chat back out to our community through our follow-up email. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Ben.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Um, I'm Ben Sagara. I'm the Wetland Program Lead with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and I'm honored to be here today to talk about tidal wetland management and restoration in the Chesapeake Bay. So I took this picture here during a flight over Guinea Marsh, which is one of the largest tidal salt marshes along the southwestern shoreline of the Chesapeake Bay, where I've been working on a significant community engagement and wetland restoration project with the Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission. And I'll touch on that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. But I really like sharing this photo because it really captures pretty much the entire area of interest for our project, which encompasses the whole salt marsh ecosystem. So at this point, we're really hoping to get a big picture, comprehensive look at existing conditions of the marsh so we can design and implement substantial shoreline erosion protection measures. We also want to plan for future protection and management of Guinea Marsh as a whole for as long as possible, which includes the Marsh Island Complex, the interior creeks, the bays, the SAV beds, the hummocks, the high marshes, and even that adjacent low-lying uphill or upland area. And one of the main reasons we really focused so heavily on this system and why I think we've been getting a lot of funding for it is because it's one of the only systems where we're really expecting high quality salt marsh complexes to persist in the lower Chesapeake Bay during this period where we're seeing continued shoreline erosion, rising sea levels, and migrating marshes. But first, I feel like we can't really start talking about all of this wetland restoration stuff without setting the stage a little. I've always found it shocking that Virginia is estimated to have lost over 40% of its wetland habitat since colonial settlement, with the Mid-Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay being called out as areas of special concern, having lost over 50% of their coastal wetland habitats. I think we can all really understand how that scale of wetland habitat loss has negatively affected many of our wildlife populations, including migratory waterfowl, shorebirds, and amphibian species. We also know that those wetlands were providing significant ecological services and are acting as critical natural infrastructure. Wetlands are providing flood mitigation, groundwater recharge, erosion prevention, and they serve as natural carbon sinks. Wetlands are also providing important recreational and commercial opportunities for the people of the Commonwealth. But during those early American years, wetlands were just not looked upon favorably. They were generally considered nasty, buggy, and unproductive lands. The U.S. government, through NRCS and soil and water conservation districts, actually supported wetland drainage until severe pollution and poor water quality in pretty much every major river and bay across the U.S. led to a slew of federal legislation in the 1970s and 80s, which has really helped slow down the rapid loss of wetlands. But even still, the last Status and Trends report shows that the U.S. has lost over 500,000 acres of vegetated wetlands between 2009 and 2019, mostly to upland and open water conversion. So we're not losing wetlands at the pace we were before, but we are still definitely in a general state of decline. And I feel like that always begs the question, well, how do we lose so many wetlands? Well, in reality, they've been impacted in one way or another. So non-tidal and tidal wetlands are often facing different threats, but in general, I think it's safe to say that ditching and draining of wetlands for agriculture and the filling in of wetlands for development have been the most detrimental to both tidal and non-tidal wetlands over time. The image you see at the top right of the screen is a heavily mosquito-ditched salt marsh, which is super common across the Northeast. These ditches were dug in the 1930s by the CCC, commissioned by the federal government, to drain stagnant pools and to stop mosquito breeding, which was largely ineffective. Nonetheless, this practice continued through the 1960s, and upwards of 90% of the salt marshes along the Northeast Atlantic coast have been mosquito ditched. In the top left, you can see how a dam creates an open water lake at the interface of a tidal river in Virginia, effectively drowning dozens of acres of marsh. In the middle on the right of the slide, you can see a portion of an old waterfowl impoundment dike, and that's at Magothy Bay Natural Area Preserve. And that was built in the high marsh area in the 60s as well to impound fresh water for waterfowl habitat. That dike already has one really large breach in it, so it no longer impounds standing freshwater for waterfowl, but you can see how the vegetation to the south of the dike, which is on the inside of the dike, is much different and less desirable than what's on the outside because that dike is still restricting that natural tidal flow. Sea level rise and coastal erosion seem to be contributing the most to an accelerated loss of existing tidal wetland acreage in recent decades. Now, marsh migration and the whole marsh gain and loss situation is really super nuanced because we are losing interior low marsh and we're losing marsh on the leading edge, but marshes are definitely also growing on the uphill side. As best as we know, over the last 100 years, Virginia actually has not experienced an acreage loss of tidal wetlands because they've been offset by marsh migration gains into adjacent ecosystems. However, by the middle of the century, somewhere in the 2050 timeline, it's expected that the loss of tidal wetlands in Virginia due to accelerating sea level rise will be outpaced by the rate of passive upland migration by tidal marshes. So by that time period, we'll really be on a path towards tidal wetland acreage declines. But this pattern of marsh persistence in Virginia isn't uniform across tidal Virginia. So some areas are already experiencing net losses. Places like small fringe marshes and particularly tidal freshwater marshes seem very vulnerable to future loss, whereas larger systems in areas with really low sloping adjacent lands like Guinea Marsh may persist or even grow for a few more decades before declining in acreage. But there are even bigger questions outside of the acreage questions, and really that revolves around the quality of these newly formed marshes versus what's currently existing and being lost. And the image in the bottom right of the screen is something I took a few weeks ago. That was at a private landowner site visit in Matthews County on the north end of Mobjack Bay, which is along the lower western Chesapeake Bay shoreline. This was a fringe low marsh, and you can really see how the vegetation is actively turning into a mud flat, and there's no low marsh forming on the uphill side. It's a really thin marsh area, and those are places where we're seeing loss and no regain. So a ton of wetlands have been lost and acreage is really continuing to decline. What are we doing about it? And the answer there is voluntary wetland restoration and enhancement. So from a policy standpoint, the importance of healthy and functioning wetlands has recently been reformally acknowledged by Bay jurisdictions when they signed the updated Beyond 2025 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. And that has wetlands outcome with lofty goals of voluntarily restoring or creating at least 3,000 acres and enhancing 1,500 acres of both tidal and non-tidal wetlands by 2040. So that's a total of 30,000 acres enhanced and 6,000 acres restored or created by 2040. And a little bit more on the tidal wetland side of things. The Bay program has recently published the Tidal Wetland Strategic Plan with the help of Chesapeake Bay Trust, and that's providing a ton of relevant guidance on how we can prepare for managing salt marsh habitats in the Bay into the future. And one of the biggest takeaways for me from this document is advocating for a shift away from largely passive management of tidal wetlands towards more active management. So the plan recommends that we develop salt marsh management plans for some of the largest and most important salt marsh complexes in each jurisdiction so we can understand their current condition, their expected future condition, and we can outline any restoration or management actions that can be taken to protect, persist, or enhance the quality of these systems through time. So CB Near in Virginia has a great example of one of these salt marsh management plans for Catlet Islands, where they're working to implement thin layer placement projects. And these plans are really pivotal in order to garner support and get funding for projects to actually manage a salt marsh. And the reason why they've been passively managed so much in the past is because they've generally been considered protected and just natural systems. But we know now how much they're changing, and that knowledge of the future change really is stimulating the need to do more management planning for those systems. All right, so we know they're important, but what are we working on? And I'll briefly cover one project, which is the Guinea Resilience and Innovation for Tidal Wetlands Project, also known as GRIT, and that's located in eastern Gloucester County. And you can see all the logos on the screen. We can't do any of this work without a ton of partnership. And with this project, we're working with NIFWIF, EPA, Middle Peninsula Planning District Commission, the UVA Institute for Engagement and Negotiation, and Consociate Media. And all those folks have reached out and engaged a bunch of other people, including tribal nations, and they formed a local advisory committee. Ultimately, we have a ton of different planning objectives that we're pursuing, including conceptual designs for things like berm removal and thin layer placement and tidal creek extension. But our only physical construction or implementation objective over the next few years is to design and build living shorelines and nearshore breakwater protection structures to protect 400 acres of tidal wetland within the Guinea Marsh system by 2029. And you can see here in the image, there's the loss of over 350 feet of marsh edge at Guinea Marsh since the 1930s. And even though we only have funding to implement shoreline protection at the moment, the planning efforts that we're doing really are just as important. So this project in partnership really started after the development of the York River Coastal Wetlands Plan, and with the help of NOAA-funded contractor SKIO, we began to realize that when you really look across the broader Chesapeake Bay landscape, Guinea Marsh has amazing potential to actually persist through time. So Guinea Marsh is one of the only large tidal salt marsh complexes along the lower western Chesapeake shoreline. That's the entire area connected to Virginia's mainland. And Ragged Island and Poquoson Flats are a little further to the south. You can see them in blue in the picture to the right. And they're really the only other two salt marshes of similar size. But They're in much more developed and urbanized watersheds, which is a very significant barrier to marsh migration, which means that large complex marsh systems may drown there without quality marsh being able to form or migrate uphill. So the Guinea Marsh wetlands and surrounding marsh migration zones really will be critical to maintaining quality marsh habitat in Tidewater, Virginia, as we face a changing climate and rising sea levels. And here at DWR, we're committed to protecting what we have at Guinea Marsh for as long as we can because it's one of the best intact salt marsh habitats we have in Virginia. And we fully recognize that that region has the ability to provide quality marsh habitat through time. That's why, in addition to the marsh migration and conservation planning, we're developing a suite of plans to slow down the existing marsh degradation for as long as we can so they can persist in place for as long as possible, because we feel that maintaining the existing marsh quality is what's going to allow for the greater likelihood of increasing future marsh persistence and quality compared to taking no action. And I want to say that one more time just because I think it's one of the biggest lessons I've learned as we plan for this project. We really need to protect the existing quality marsh for as long as possible so we can allow for quality marshes to form on that uphill side. It takes time for quality marshes to form, and even with barriers to marsh migration in place, a significant acreage of marsh will form in the spaces that are currently uplands. We've seen it happen, we're seeing it happen, but there is a significant question as to the quality of those newly formed marshes. And here at Guinea Marsh, with this funding, we really think that we can learn how to plan and facilitate this natural process as best as possible, and hopefully we can maintain this large quality salt marsh system in the lower Chesapeake Bay. And that's all I got for y'all today regarding salt marsh management and restoration in the bay. I know Kate's going to be talking a lot more about the marsh migration topic, so I'll pass it over to her and we'll field some questions here at the end. Let's see.
Great, thanks, Ben.
There we go.
With me while we pitch presenters and screens. If you all seeing my notes or are you seeing my good screen?
We're seeing your good screen.
Amazing. All right. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Ben, for kicking us off so well. I'm Kate Tully. I'm a professor of agroecology at the University of Maryland. And when I first made this talk, I had it kind of a different flavor to it, but then I read some of all of your wonderful questions and I kind of tweaked it a little bit. So I think Ben set us up really nicely. And I want to sort of talk about marsh migration, private lands. So, okay, so I'll start.
Kate, we just saw your something pop up on the screen there.
Does that look good or bad?
That's better.
That's better.
It's so bizarre. Okay, that's never happened before. Thanks, Ben. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about just marsh migration into agriculture, and then I'll talk a little bit about managing the transition. So, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I have coming forward. So here I just wanted to sort of emphasize something that Ben was talking about. So about 85% of tidal marshes exist on privately owned lands. And so it's super important that we figure out how to engage landowners, work with landowners in order to meet those tidal wetland targets that Ben was talking about. And so oftentimes if I was like on a stage, I'd sort of like use my body language to emphasize this point. But essentially, a lot of times if we're the folks who are working on marsh migration and like trying to increase marshes on the landscape, I imagine that we're standing in the marsh and we're looking at the upland area and we're thinking about, okay, what's upslope and how do we manage these lands in order to create these really wonderful marsh ecosystems. You can also imagine, though, that you're a landowner, and imagine that this image that I have here is your farm, and you're standing on the farm and you're looking and you're seeing some of these marsh grasses that you can see in the foreground here starting to migrate onto your property, and that you might actually see that as a financial threat. And so what I'm trying to do with a lot of our work is walk this line, and how do we create programs or practices that work both for the marshes but also for landowners. Oh my gosh, why is it doing that? I'm just going to click. So this, if you've never seen what marsh migration looks like on an agricultural field, now you have. This is a sorghum field in Dorchester County, Maryland. And the first thing your eye will be drawn to is that big line that's bisecting. This is one of those ditches that Ben was mentioning. So the landowner dug this ditch in order to try to get water off of the field. Obviously now it's bringing water onto the field, which you can see this area right here. So it will work. Definitely have zoom issues right here. All this algae here in the foreground. But what I want to draw your attention to is down in the sort of the back left corner of the field. So you can see this sort of texture and also color change in the vegetation. This is Spartina patens, one of our native marsh species, and it's right next to sorghum, right? So this is a marsh that's migrated due to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion onto this coastal agricultural field. So some of our work, we wanted to try to understand the extent of this intrusion and then also marsh migration. So we did a study that was published in 2023. And we found between 2011 and 2017, we saw a doubling of these visible salt patches. So that's these white areas that I was just showing you here. And so this data is just data of our coastal counties in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, with those blue bars being that first flight, the National Ag Inventory Program flight. Those big yellow bars being, of course, the salt patches that were visible in that second flight. So we saw this doubling. Salt patches, which are indicative, right, of these salts that are the landward movement of sea salts. In addition, we found that 20,000 acres of farmland converted to marsh in that time period. So that's a short period of time. We're seeing a lot of farmland conversion to marsh. But something that Ben mentioned, I also just want to emphasize, it's not necessarily high quality marsh. So this is something that we need to think about, like how are we going to make sure that some of these marshes that we're starting to see form, and some of these are managed, but some of them are unmanaged, and we want to really try to make sure that they're giving us all of those ecosystem services that we're looking for. If you're interested, this data is available online. This is just a little video of what you can do with our salt patch mapper tool. I'm going to throw that link in the chat later. But you can zoom in and you can toggle between these two flights. This is focusing on those salt intrusions, so it'll just show you where you're seeing the salt and how it's changed in those two time periods. So now I want to talk a little bit about managing the transition. This is work I've done with my wonderful colleague, Becky Apanchin-Neal, who's also at the University of Maryland. When we think about the way that landowners are responding to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, we kind of put them in these three buckets. First are protective measures, agricultural practice adjustments, and land transition. I do not have time to talk about all of these today, so I'm just going to focus on the land transitions. For context, protective measures would be something that maybe a landowner would do to actually prevent marsh migration or saltwater intrusion. So this would be like putting in a tide gate or building up the surface elevation field. Agricultural practice adjustments will be something like increasing or changing from corn, which is not very salt tolerant, to something like sorghum, which is pictured here, which is a more salt tolerant species. We're going to talk about land transition. And so the one concept that's sort of really important that we've sort of teased apart over the last decade or so of research is and it's not rocket science, it's all about elevation, right? So but specifically the elevation of an agricultural field with respect to the mean higher water level, which is what I have here on the axis. And this is just going to show you some data that we've collected on some of our farm fields, showing you the electrical conductivity here. This is obviously as you get more, the traditional agricultural crops do not like that, but that's also an opportunity for where we might start to see some of these salt marshes starting to encroach. Our critical threshold that we've determined is around 0.6 meters above that mean higher water level. So if you are below that, if you have that elevation below that, that's when you're pretty much not going to be able to farm anymore. And these would be, this is an example of where we might want to start focusing some of our attention into putting in salt marshes. or facilitating that transition. We also have to know what's going to live and what's going to die when we do that. So this is some work from my postdoc, Patricia Barros, and then my PhD student, Schulenberg. And here we've done some research on 2 different salt and farms where we've planted a bunch of warm season grasses that are native to this region. Some of them you're going to see will be familiar to you. So we want to figure out what's going to grow, and it's not as easy as it may seem, because these agricultural fields have a very healthy weed seed bank. So the species have to be very competitive with those agricultural weeds. And we also wanted to ensure that they were eligible, whatever farmers might be planting are eligible for CS programs or practices, so they actually can receive financial incentives. And this is very important because we need to figure out how to support this transition without putting the sole burden of all these the financial burden solely on the landowner. So we planted some panicum species, Spartinas. There's our Spartina patens again. And then Florida paspalum and Eastern gamagrass, which is the Tripsacum dactyloides. These are all considered halophytes. They're well adapted to survive in these saline and anoxic soils. And I'm going to show you a table, which is the worst in presentations, but unfortunately, I feel like this is the best way to kind of summarize what we found briefly. So I'm just going to show you the species, also the biomass, so the amount of biomass these species put on, salt accumulation. Then these are NRCS programs on the right-hand side. And you'll see a star, which means that they're eligible for that program. The data, I know it's a little bit overwhelming, but the main takeaway here is that here we have our programs. They do pretty well, and they're eligible for a lot of practice. We do not recommend planting this Florida paspalum. It did not do well at all. And then our Spartinas do great, not surprisingly. They also actually take sodium up into their tissues, which if you harvested it, you could remove it from the system. But they're not eligible for a lot of practices, so which maybe they should be. So this would be something where we might recommend amendments being made in our Chesapeake Bay region so that we can allow for more folks to actually be adopting these practices and getting those financial incentives. Then Tripsacum dactyloides, the last species, that's your Eastern gamagrass. That does great. You can buy it from seed easily, and it's eligible for a lot of practice. That was a nice surprise. The next step, of course, is putting this research that I just talked about into action, which I'm very pleased to say that we are doing. We actually think the contract was signed on Monday. This is a collaboration between the NRCS, our research efforts and scientists, and a landowner in Maryland, where we're kind of piloting the first saltwater intrusion, tidal marsh restoration NRCS practice. We're using some of these science-based studies. So this is the field of interest here. I have a heat map where the red or the warmer colors are the higher elevation points in this agricultural area, and the cool colors are our lower elevations, all with respect to mean high or high water. So this is a map that we've created based on our knowledge of this site and this important critical threshold of 0.6 meters. And we are going to be planting sort of strategically based on this map, Spartina patens, panicum, and that Eastern gamagrass, and some other salt tolerant, some other native marsh species. I think we're going to throw pectinata in there and maybe some disticlus. So we're going to be planting this salt marsh, and then on the highest elevation in that field, we're going to plant some salt tolerant trees and shrubs. So we have like willow oak and persimmon, honey locust, eastern red cedar. So this is going to start in the spring, and we're really excited about it. So stay tuned. For in a couple years, I'll have all the data for you guys. But just looking ahead, I'm leading an effort called Rising. So this is something, if you're interested in this work, I'd love for folks on this call to get involved. Rising stands for Resilience Implementation for Salt Intruded Geographies. I'll put that link in the chat later. The grant is through the NSF, and it's a collaboration between University of Maryland, University of Delaware, and the Jacques Cousteau NEAR. We're a group of farmers, foresters, woodlot owners, landowners, government, academia, nonprofit, private sector. So a lot of folks working together on these sort of resilience strategies for privately owned coastal farms and forests. We're focusing on Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and Virginia. And the idea is to co-develop strategies that are going to work for these private landowners who are, in the coastal zone. One cool tool I just wanted to give you guys a peek of is our options for adapting to rising seas, or OARS tool. So this is a guide to financing and implementing these resilience practices. So you can kind of see where we're going. We're trying to now make this like really user friendly. It's going to be a web-based tool, and we imagine that a service provider, probably like a lot of you on this call, would actually help a landowner go through this series of questions, and then it'll spit out a series of options, different kinds of programs and practices that could be implemented on that piece of property. This is just like a mock-up of what the tool is going to look like. So they'll answer questions about where the field might be or the woodlot is. We'll give them information on sort of the stage of saltwater intrusion, and then a series of options for the different ways that they could manage that in the coastal zone. And our hope is that this will increase the adoption of practices that support habitat conservation, carbon storage, and of course that marsh, increasing our tidal marshes in the coastal zone. With that, I'm going to be quiet. And this is a QR code that, again, will take you to that Rising link. And I have some other links up there, and you're welcome to contact me. And thanks so much for your attention and your patience with my weird Zoom, whatever that was going on. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben and Kate. It was a great way to set the stage for the conversation coming up. There's a lot going on and so much to think about. So we really appreciate your careful walkthrough of some of your experience and those priorities. It was really great. So a question that came in the chat was, how long does it take for a recently migrated marsh to gain ecological functions? And that restoration of the ecological function was something we saw in the questions ahead of time as well.
I guess I could try this one. So I saw Kevin responded, and it, like most things in biology, it definitely depends on what function we're talking about and what system we're in. Um, Oftentimes, you can see things like vegetation or animals come back relatively quickly. Uh, but depends on the area. Some areas have way more frag, or some areas have way more water influence, and that can influence what species take hold. But in a lot of areas, like at Guinea Marsh in particular, where they were previously farm fields 100 years ago, is relatively quality salt marsh. That salt marsh has a really little bit of carbon, though, because the carbon takes forever to accumulate. And that's kind of how we're estimating the age of some of these things. That's beyond what we can see in an aerial image, is the amount of carbon getting stacked up on the soil profile. So it depends on the function for sure. And that's why we'd like to provide as much time as possible for those things to form.
And I'll just hop in there and say, so I know the question was about migrated marsh, but if you're talking about, of course, like a restored marsh, right? Like the project I just mentioned, that's a whole nother layer of complication too, right? So we don't, that's why I was like, I'll tell you in maybe 4 years, I'll have some better idea of how well the ecological functions have been restored.
Great, thank you. Another question that just came in is, if wetlands are helping Maryland meet its TMDL goals, is there a way to compensate farmers with converting land cover for those reductions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment? If farmers' penchant for growing plants to support communities, not just food, could be unleashed, it could be an incredibly productive relationship. So curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll take a stab at that. I'm not going to say that I know all of the TMDL rules. I mean, I think that there's a lot of right now programs that are available at least through the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and Maryland Department of Agriculture. So every single state will have different programs, and that's actually one of the reasons we're developing this tool that I mentioned. Is we have like the NRCS programs that can be used in all 50 states, but then also there's like individual programs that are specific to the different states. And so I know that at least in Maryland, we have some new programs that are available to Maryland landowners specifically. The other thing I'll mention about this is why I'm hedging a little bit because it's super complex. You'd think the financing for this stuff would be really simple, but it's actually super complicated because sometimes it even comes down to like folks are interested in a very specific hydrological unit. Like one huck is where like it's just we've decided that that is where we want to put our finances. So I think there's a lot of opportunity though, which is why that ORS tool, I'm really excited about it because I think it's going to also illuminate where there's opportunities to leverage funding or increase help increase the adoption.
Yeah, and as far as TMDLs go, wetlands are a practice. I don't know about tidal wetlands in particular. I know shoreline protection, you can get some nutrient and sediment reduction counted towards TMDL goals. Um, but by and large, wetlands have been excluded from the TMDL Chesapeake Bay accounting process. There's been a couple of projects, but I haven't seen many. And I think that they don't have a super is not a great bang for your buck for that type of a project. So when we've been seeing wetland projects get implemented, it's more on the voluntary side for protecting that acreage rather than the co-benefit of uh, nutrient sediment reduction. And oftentimes the nutrient sediment reduction isn't being counted if the project's being done for another reason, like NRCS cover crop or an NRCS habitat focused program or another large grant program like at Guinea Marsh. I'm not sure if we're calculating or reporting any of our nutrient and sediment loads to the Chesapeake Bay program. We're more concerned with the acreage gains in enhancement, just based on how the project was funded. But that co-benefit problem has certainly been pervasive, particularly with wetlands, because oftentimes wetlands are getting restored or enhanced, but it's not the main reason, say a cattle exclusion or a stream restoration project, um, or other TMDL projects where the TMDL stuff's getting calculated, but not the acreage. So there's definitely something going on there. And then as far as paying private landowners, in Virginia, there is a pay for performance recent addition to trying to reach the TMDL goals. So a landowner or a landowner working with a consultant or something could propose a TMDL action on a private land through that pay for performance program. And if they are, awarded, they could potentially go through that avenue. But that's more experimental. Um, yeah, the funding of it is definitely complicated.
Well, thanks, Ben, for sharing those thoughts and you as well, Kate. And um, Kate, you've started to hone in on this question in the chat, but I'm just going to raise it here for some additional thought and discussion and maybe some input from Ben as well. But how do you see the need for wetland conservation and migration interfacing with the land trust community? So, Kate, if you want to start and continue your thread of thought there, and then Ben, if you have anything to add, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, the land trust is actually they're a co-PI on some of the projects that I mentioned. So the project that I showed you with the demonstration site, we're working with the Lower Shore Land Trust, really close partner. And the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy is also one of they've been helping us from the very beginning with this because they are the folks who are working directly with landowners. And we've been working with them for probably like 8 or 9 years now, as again, like interfacing with the because they've really built up a lot of trust in the community. And so you need partners like that who are going to be able to maybe serve as a liaison between the researchers, the farmers, and the landowners in the community. Super important.
We're working with different land trusts as well and TNC. And one of the big things that we've been kind of concerned with is there hasn't been a ton of examples of, or there's not a lot of programs for easements in the marsh migration space in particular. And oftentimes easements for tidal wetlands haven't been pursued or preferred because those areas are kind of already considered protected from development. And so they've been overlooked or avoided in the past. And now we're asking these conservation agencies to hone in on and focus on some of these marsh migration corridor areas and the upland tidal areas. So working with those land trusts to develop easement programs that specifically target the marsh migration corridor areas is definitely something that we're working on.
Great, thank you. In the questions that we received ahead of time, there were a couple with a common thread of prioritization, like trying to choose what projects you're going to undertake and where. So are there certain criteria that as you're considering that you're looking for, or different information needs that you have to have before you can make a decision on where to work?
I want to let Kate go because I've got a more practical answer, and I bet she's got a more science.
I don't know if I do. I think I work where I find partners who are willing to work, which I think is what Ben's gonna say, right? I think um of course we can do all the optimization and we can say these areas, but ultimately, like on a private land, you need to have the trust of the landowner. And that is sort of how, it almost makes the priorities for you. I mean, in an ideal world, it wouldn't be like that. But I don't know, Ben, is that what you were going to say? Or something
Yeah,
similar?
unfortunately, the priority ends up becoming where there's capacity to focus on a specific area, oftentimes, or where there's a interested landowner or site. And I'm a public employee. I work for the state government. And so it's a lot easier for us to work on public lands. And oftentimes, especially with this tidal wetland restoration and management idea, a lot of these things are very innovative and novel to some degree. And the permitting agencies don't exactly know what to approve or when to approve it or what information is needed to approve it. And so for me, this idea of developing management plans on large public land sites is pretty critical to show success for a couple of projects. And then we can transition that into private lands. I'm really appreciative of what Kate's doing too, working with private landowners and existing programs, because that is where the majority of our wetlands are. But I also think that we need to be working on public lands, showing success, and then spreading that to private landowners as we can. And a good example of that would be like living shorelines. We were doing that on public lands first. We kind of honed in on the importance of it in Virginia, and now there's a host of private landowner resources able to implement those living shoreline practices, and it got their own permitting pathway and everything. So yeah, we're usually prioritizing where we can work on it, where there's capacity, where there's interested landowners, and then I'm focusing on public lands that honestly, a lot of other people have come together to say, oh, this area looks like it's worth protecting the most. I mean, that's what we're seeing. Guinea Marsh and Saxus seem to be areas that we're focusing on for the persistent place and large scale, uh, long-term projects. Other areas like fringe marshes and freshwater marshes we're working on because they're super vulnerable. And honestly, we don't know exactly what we're going to do to protect them or if there is much we can do.
Great. Thanks for that. So you've both mentioned the importance of engaging private landowners. That's where a lot of the areas that we need to work are located in. And Kate, you mentioned the ORS app, which sort of allows you to, offer landowners engagement at different scales. And that was something that came up as a question. Are there opportunities for landowners to engage who may not, be willing to offer up, a huge area of their land, but want to do something? So can you talk a little bit, and Ben, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts too about the scale of the project and different options. And, is there a small scale that you can work at, or do you get to a point where it has to be a certain, size before you're really seeing the value for that work and input?
Okay, that's a great question. So there's the value, but there's also like there are of course eligibility requirements, right? Like in some cases, some practices have like a minimum number of acres, but I do think you can do stuff at the small scale. I'm gonna actually, dare I share my screen again? Let's see if this works. But I did want to, so this tool that we're trying to develop, you could do it just for a farm, one field, right? So the thought would be that you could do this for a small area, and that this would walk the farmer through that, or the landowner through that particular, you know, for that exact field, like what you want to do. And I think that's actually been a sticking point because um, a lot of the rest, like the big restoration projects require, you have to work with like very large vendors. Like, there's some nurseries who they only sell wholesale, and then I only need X number of plants for this. I need a lot of plants. To me, it's a lot of plants to plant, but to them, it's small potatoes. And so actually, I do think that there's a certain amount of actually downscaling of the market too. So like, can local nurseries, if you're going to do this, we also need like local nurseries that can provide the the seed plugs that are going to go on these smaller scales. So I've one of the reasons that I've been working at this small scale is to try to figure out where all those choke points are, so that we can try to alleviate them, for future, to increase the adoption of some of these practices. I hope that answers the question, because of course we want a lots of marshes, but it may end up being a patchwork, right? Where you're going to need a couple farmers in this area. And in order to do that, you're going to need to sort of figure out how to do that on, maybe 11, 12, 13 acre fields.
Yeah, I'd agree. Both are super important in both scales. I mean, there are people like me and like managers of wildlife refuges or wildlife management areas. They're going to focus on probably larger sites, but 80–90% of these tidal wetlands are on private lands, and a lot of these private lands are cut up into small parcels. And if we can't effectively work on smaller scale projects, we aren't going to effectively do large scale work. So I really think it is all important. And it's incredible the amount of wildlife I've seen in really small scale sites. I mean, you dig a 30-foot hole in some spots and you create a little freshwater wetland, and you'll see loads of animals piling in there the next season. So um, scale is definitely something to consider, but I think right now with how novel all this is, you got to do some small scale stuff just to show successes. There's also going to be small scale projects that we want to continue to fund, and you just got to look for different technical service providers to help with those different types of projects. Like there are public employees working on public lands, like land manager type people. And then there's other TSPs like soil and water conservation districts or NRCS, which might often work on smaller scale projects with smaller farmers, or soil and water conservation districts. VCAP definitely works on a lot of smaller scale projects. And when you put them all together, it's a really big impact.
That's great. Thanks. Follow-up question related to scale here is the comment in the chat says this scale question has me thinking about urban areas where constructed wetlands may be on the order of 5 acres. What do you think of sub or urban projects?
I always like urban projects too. I mean, you think about DC, they've lost most of their marshes. It was all a swamp that's been filled in or wetlands that have been filled in. If you're not doing smaller scale projects there, then you're really missing out on anything. Um, and in the urban projects. And I've seen incredible wetlands in urban areas that are doing a lot that's where a lot of our pollutants are. And so if we're not doing projects in urban areas, we're not curbing the pollution where it's sourcing itself. So um, those projects are oftentimes not as ecologically as interesting. They're more, I'd say, like stormwater driven type projects that I've seen personally. Um, but they can be ecologically interesting, and they definitely have, I think, a ton of ecological value, and they provide a lot of services.
Kate's given the thumbs up on that as well. So thanks. Thanks for that answer. So again, another question that we had from ahead of time, and you both sort of touched on this, is long-term success and sustainment of these restoration efforts. And two things that I heard from your presentations that I think sound like they would be really critical elements to have in a project to make it sustainable and successful long term. Seems like elevation is clearly a factor, and species selection for the different types of plants that you're bringing into it. Are there other things in addition, or are those the two main areas of focus as you're planning a project?
I'm going to answer one. I think, I mean, the other part is money, right? I
Yeah.
think, and the financing of those pieces, and making, and you have to kind of thread the needle for those. So again, like if you're thinking about it from the perspective of a private landowner, and this is just practical, this isn't like an ecological thing, but it's just like we have to, there are going to be some landowners who, and I work with some of them who, for, they're really committed to the conservation, and it doesn't matter whether or not they can get reimbursed for some of the practices that they're, for a lot of folks, it is going to matter. And so making sure that we also are doing it in a way meets their goals, right? Whatever their goals are, if it's recreation or hunting, if you're in a lot, but that also is not putting the whole financial burden. That's not necessarily like an ecological, um, consideration, but I do think that it's something that's super important. Again, like if you're that farmer who's looking at the marsh, seeing it come onto your property, putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about the things they're going to need to, the boxes they'll need to check to make a change at the end of the day.
Definitely finances are huge. In addition to elevation and vegetation, I'm often looking for things like tidal flow restriction. So maybe you've got the elevation here, but there might be a berm out in front of it or somewhere else, or maybe a culvert or something that's undersized that's really limiting that migration potential. So there's tidal flow restrictions. Um, if there's nearby invasive vegetation, maybe that's something that you're watching out for. Like if there's a ton of Phragmites right where your marsh is migrating towards versus an open farm field, well, that open farm field might be a lot easier to transition smoother than the Phragmites dominated area. And something that's emerging, I mean, I don't know, I haven't seen a ton of science on this, but anecdotally, it seems that a lot of people, at least here in Virginia that I've talked to, are kind of feeling like we often say that marshes are migrating into upland areas. And I think that the misconception there is that there is a ton of forested wetland areas that they're migrating into. So they're migrating uphill, but not always into uplands. And they're sometimes migrating into wetlands. They're tidal wetlands migrating into non-tidal wetlands. And in those areas, we see that uphill hydrology might really be strongly influencing the ability for things like Phragmites to take hold in inhibiting the things like salt marsh vegetation to take hold as quickly. It's anecdotal, but maybe these non-tidal freshwater areas are some of our worst marshes, worst quality marshes because there's that hydrologic freshwater input that's really decreasing the salinity and allowing other plants to be competitive, where salt marsh plants and making salt marsh plants less competitive. So those are a couple of other factors that I'm thinking about um, with a lot of these projects.
That's great. Thank you. And it's so interesting to think about, a tidal marsh migrating into a non-tidal marsh, and the implications of that. Just a really interesting point that you brought up there. A question just came in the chat sort of about the relationship between marshes and ghost forests and if there's any impacts from that relationship. So if you have any thoughts or knowledge about that.
I can just quick take this, but then Ben, if you want to jump in, but basically I mean, so ghost forests are just the sort of the when the forests are, the osmotic stress that's induced in the trees because of saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, causes those trees to die, and they're not necessarily. That's a space that we do see marshes moving into for sure. But as Ben just said, if there's a lot of frag or if there's a lot of freshwater input, and frag really likes that like dappled sunlight. If you have a patch where a tree dies, creates kind of like a space in the canopy, that's where you're going to start to see that Phragmites come in. And so there's, we see a lot of native marsh species in those, but we also, one of the big issues, I think, in some of those ghost forests is the frag for some of the reasons that Ben was just mentioning. And it's really, really hard to start to try to figure out how to manage those invasives in some of those forests. Ben, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I don't see ghost forests as being a threat to restoring those marshes, but it is something that we're seeing those marshes move into forested areas, and ghost forests are forming as a result of that. And there are questions as to whether or not we can do anything to facilitate marsh migration where we see it occurring in forested areas. And I think that that's a big question and a big what if. I know Matt Kerwin at the VIMS lab is looking at doing some culling of trees to see if that might enhance or speed up the process of marsh migration. And I've heard anecdotally from folks at like Chincoteague Wildlife Refuge that they've seen die-offs of trees and from like salt, storm surge type events, and there'll be a big influx of salt and the trees will die off. And if you cut the trees too early, or if the trees die too early, it just comes back as thick dog hair pines, not a salt marsh, because the salt marsh takes a while to form and the trees die slower than it takes the salt marsh to form. So there's a ton of questions there into how to facilitate marsh migration. If there's a threat for ghost forest, it's really not knowing how to best manage that migration as it happens, and the timing of it's all very confusing as to when and what you can do to intervene to make it better.
Thanks for your thoughts on that. And Kate, you mentioned Phragmites, and we just got a question about Phragmites in the chat. And the question reads, I've heard some people think we shouldn't spend the time treating them because of how resilient they are and their shoreline stabilization capabilities. Do you have any thoughts on Phragmites in terms of the benefits that might be realized through its appearance and how we should be dealing with that?
That's a tough one. So I'll say that so we've been doing I'm also I'll put on my biogeochemist hat for a second. And so I'll just say that Phragmites biogeochemically is completely different than our native marshes. So it completely alters the biogeochemical cycling. And so that mean and with respect to carbon, so yes, there is a certain amount of stabilization, right, that it can afford an ecosystem. But it also can produce, this is some research that we actually are going to publish soon, hopefully, but it shows like there's actually a lot of methane production under these Phragmites stands. So I think they're like in certain ecosystem functions, you might be like, oh, Phragmites is exactly kind of what we need. But in other cases, it's actually may not be the greatest thing, right? So we know that it doesn't provide a lot of habitat, and it's all the reasons why we don't like Phragmites being invasive. But actually, biogeochemically, it's kind of changing the carbon balance in some ways. And so we have some research that it's forthcoming that should be published pretty soon on that. And the short story is that Phragmites can create a lot of carbon, and then our native species, especially Spartina patens, is an incredibly important species to keep around in our marshes.
Yeah, I know we're running up against time here, but I'll just say that we're treating Phragmites where it makes sense. It's definitely not everywhere. I don't think we're eradicating Phragmites from Virginia or from the Chesapeake Bay, but there are some really high quality systems that we can keep Phragmites out of. And places like our natural area preserves, we put a lot more effort into keeping the frag out than some areas that are already frag dominated, like Back Bay in Southeast Virginia. Phragmites might be the only thing growing there, and if we remove it, we might lose the edge or the islands, or every effort to remove it just comes back with more Phragmites. So where we're seeing positive effects or where we're really keeping it out of particularly good areas, I think it's super important, but it can be like banging your head against the wall, killing Phragmites for it just to come back up. So I wouldn't, yeah, keep doing it if that's what's happening.
Well, thank you, Ben and Kate, for your time and your thoughts today. We really appreciate it. This has been a really interesting subject. I feel like we could spend a whole nother hour going through some of these questions and all of the details. So we appreciate your time, and thanks to the folks for attending and providing such a lovely and lively discussion. So we appreciate all of you and hope to see you back here again in September.